Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Jolly. I don't like my own symbol I inherited. I'm doing my best to reduce the size of it each time it appears in public. It may disappear entirely by 2018. I've been invited to speak from some points of view for another industry, from the rail industry. So if you take the last 30 years I represent, working on underground and overground rail schemes, light rail and guided busways, which require legislation and seem to attract their own particularly evil brew of reasons to object to them. But that's where I come from railways. I've not been a complaint commissioner all my life. I'm the fourth one involved with Crossrail and HS1 in a continuous line from the same office over the last 17 years. The words in blue are the words that were proposed to me I should look at, and if you'll bear with me, I'll try and quickly go through some of these bullet points. Suggestion of best practice. Well, when I write to Crossrail with recommendations, I try and use the phrase better practice because I have to confess that in my long career I've been party to some of the worst practices around in terms of neglecting to carry out thorough community engagement. The LDDC was mentioned earlier, and a shiver went up my spine because although I didn't work for them, I'm aware of what happened when I was part of the original Docklands Light Railway. So let's settle for better. Who is really leading your project? I've been on the platforms at public meetings. I can recall a West End ticket hall scheme where everyone on the top platform was a consultant, and the freeholders, influential freeholders in the West End, sussed us out. The project subsequently failed, and I like to think that the rot set in from that moment when the audience realised they're not actually dealing with the people in charge of it, just people who are supposed to be good at presenting projects. The tyranny of emails is something I used to share terrible emails with colleagues on other projects. The pace of emailing really can eat into and destroy the ability quite often to establish good community engagement. In my present role, I've seen complainants expecting email replies within 2 hours. When I've looked into the case, if the case has come to me to consider, I've found something over 63 emails sent in 36 hours, permed deliberately to different addresses, different combinations of address. So if you can with your project in your sphere, in your industry, keep ahead of emails, keep away from them as much as possible. I've also noticed the trend, and it may not apply to yourselves, to appoint the director of communications from a media relations background, who then in turn looks for a public relations or public affairs manager or director, and then in turn thinks, oh yes, we better cover off community relations as well. I would suggest that for successful community engagement, maybe just consider doing it the other way around. Believe it or not, there are railway schemes that don't always deliver on promises. It does happen. And something that particularly concerns me, because I think it matters for people to understand what you're doing and delivering, is it possible to write your project history when you finish the project only from your e-bulletins, websites, newsletters and house journals? Do you put dates on them, proper dates? Do you admit works overruns that didn't get covered off in the last newsletter? And do you publish them on some kind of scale that people can learn to expect? Finally, under this heading, if you're going to go for external scrutiny, and you think that's a good idea, a role like mine, I can only recommend that you make sure you've got all your local authorities drawn into that before you get anywhere with the scheme. My independent strength with Crossrail is from the 18 local authorities from way out west to way out east that contribute financially and technically to so I can deliver my job. The price to pay for remoteness, more friction. We discussed with the organisers of the conference about the Ivory Towers situation, and the ODA was mentioned, one of my former employers, and some current schemes like Crossrail. They're at the top of the steel and glass towers at Canary Wharf. They're not clad in ivory, but is that the right place to be? Does that send out the right message for people living down on the ground in 1- or 2-storey, 3-storey properties, and you are somewhere above the 23rd floor? Might suggest it doesn't. The more you get down to the ground and listen to people, the more intelligence you gather, the better you'll be able to anticipate issues, and I've never known that not to be the case. Harmonious start to relations. Well, I suspect with what I've heard at this conference and nearly all the railway schemes I've been involved in, it's very hard to find the actual start date or start moment. I just wonder, how many of you work for local authorities here? Some have worked for local authorities. Some more. How many of you pay your council tax? Yeah, good. Well, you'll know that local authorities are up against it on delivery, on recruitment and many other spheres. It's tough working for local authorities. I know that from my own experiences, and I often worry that projects don't respect the problems they have or they can give local authorities, balancing out resources. I can recall quite well a local meeting connected with one of the projects I've been involved in, where went along the 48 eligible residents, 3 attended, fair enough, they represented the other 45. 2 local authority officers, a very good EHO, worked off his feet. How many people came from that large project, might you imagine? Quick. Well, 11 came. Now, is 11 to 3 to 2 the right way to be talking to a local community that feels quite oppressed by, in that case, airborne noise? And as soon as the construction phase of airborne noise ended, they realised that the permanent installations of ventilation fans for the tunnelled railway underneath them would be there for the rest of their lives while they lived in the area. How much is history of your relations with statutory stakeholders, consultees and local authorities? Is it at all possible to define a start moment and, as it were, start again? I can recall one scheme in central London. It was the Jubilee Line extension, the last big project before Crossrail, where a local authority was knocking lumps off London Underground and the parliamentary team that I was in. And in the end, we almost got to a point of mutual exhaustion during the bill petitioning period and started again with a fresh list. This is what the borough wants, this is what we think we can deliver. And that was the basis of going forward through the bill process. And also from my time in local government, when I was in Cambridgeshire, I can recall my transport director, whenever a minister came to visit Cambridge, he always said to us, make sure that the minister goes back to London with some wins in his pocket. Let's not be on local television knocking lumps off the government just because it's of a different colour. So if you get close to people, there's a fair chance you understand what they actually want, and that particularly, I think, applies to local authorities. If you get community relations right, my proposition would be that the media relations won't be anything like as tough to manage, because there shouldn't be quite so many issues out there floating about unresolved and unanswered. And although everyone thinks they're very proactive, my experience with railway schemes has been that the larger they are, the harder they actually find to be proactive, and they tend to fall back on due process and what's in the act. Having said that, Crossrail are very good at getting out there and surveying and measuring how people feel about the impacts around their 40 work sites. That may be in part to knock down my criticism sometimes, but I don't think it is. I think it's a solid piece of work which fully involves all the local authorities and is shared with the local authorities and is shared with the residents at local panel meetings. And that's, I can only say that good for them for doing it. They become more accessible by going through a process. I was asked this one, which is the hardest one, and I think, truthfully, where the railways have got the least to offer to yourselves, because the railway scheme itself is often seen as the benefit, and the local station as the benefit, and wider community impacts. Well, people take a view that you've got the railway. However, when that's said to local audiences, and I've witnessed this at Whitechapel, where Crossrail people have said you'll be able to get to Heathrow in so many minutes, over the last 3 or 4 years of airborne noise issues, the stock answer is, I use Stansted. And if you say it to the residents of Barbican, a little bit further to the west, their answer is, well, we use Farringdon to get to Luton and to get to Gatwick on Thameslink. So the railway scheme itself just becomes accepted so very, very quickly. It's often not seen as hardly a benefit at all after a few years. If you talk to a railway construction project team like I do, it's not in the Act, we don't have to do it. I've had that said to me numbers of times. And the National Compensation Code and blight notices, if you serve a blight notice on some of the schemes I've worked on, you will not get a sack of cash delivered in the car park at midnight. They'll go through only and correctly, let's say, through formal process. I have a particular idea that there is scope for a charitable trust to take a longer-term view of managing benefits in a particular area around a construction corridor like a railway. I'm a trustee of a charity. I know how hard it is to comply with charity law sometimes. I know how hard it is to find trustees who will stick to the terms of the trust. But it's an idea that I think possibly has some merit. Finally, on my bullet points, Crossrail is a scheme that requires the contractors to deliver community benefits, often training and education-based, volunteering management time, near the work sites. In practice, they're often a mile or two from the work sites. They're often very temporary. But the audience to receive the wider information, I'm afraid, are the people who live right on top of the work sites who are most likely to be suffering from the direct impacts. It's a very good scheme. They're very proud of it. The contractors are rightly proud of it. But it is quite limited in its real overall benefits. And finally, not a bullet pointed, please don't call everybody a stakeholder. I recall at the ODA, I think we ended up with more transport stakeholders and people actually to move in the Olympic transport plan to Stratford. People often resent it, the assumption that they're on your side. Seems to be what's taken with that phrase. Whatever you want to call them, just go light on stakeholder.